So welcome to this event for the Cambridge Science Festival in conjunction with the Cambridge Climate Lecture Series. My name's Hugh Hunt and I'm the chairman of the Cambridge Climate Lecture Series. The Cambridge Climate Lecture Series began shortly after the death of David Mackay. Some of you will remember David. He was an extraordinary thinker on energy and climate and renewable resources. He had just been appointed as the Regius Professor in Engineering. He had written this remarkable book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. It's available free online if you want to look into it. So I'm very glad that our CCLS is now in its third year and going strong. So thank you, David, for inspiring us to do this. The lectures we've had so far in the CCLS have been over the last 4 weeks. The pattern really is that in February, on Thursdays, we do talks every Thursday, and then the fifth lecture is an event here for the Cambridge Science Festival. If you want to get onto the CCLS mailing list, then if you go to our website and sign up for the mailing list there. We've got an event coming up on Monday, the 25th of March, which is talking about sustainability in general, not just about climate change. So if you would like to come along to that, do sign up for that event. So on to tonight. We're very pleased that we're doing this thing for James Lovelock, who turns 100 this year. My guess is that he's tuned in listening to this. He apologises that he can't be here tonight. It's just a bit difficult. But we visited him just recently and recorded some great stuff, which you will hear tonight. He's got plenty of great stuff to say. So he's best known for his work on proposing the Gaia hypothesis, and tonight you will hear a lot about that. It's all about postulating that the Earth functions as some kind of self-regulating system. Tonight, then, we've got a discussion with three climate-related scientists. Chris Rapley, who's a professor of Earth Sciences at University College London. He was, for some time, director of the British Antarctic Survey and was director of the Science Museum in London. And Tim Lenton is director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. And he has for a long time been inspired by Jim Lovelock's books on Gaia, and he's working on identifying the tipping elements in the climate system. And our chair for this evening is physicist and oceanographer Helen Czerski at the University College London, and she's passionate about understanding the physical engine of the Earth and of our atmosphere and the oceans. And last summer you may have seen that she was on a Swedish and American research expedition into the Arctic, and that sounded like it was a great challenge. So without further ado, I'd like you to welcome to these lovely red chairs our panel for this evening.
And it's lovely to see you, and it's lovely actually for me to be back here, because I think my first ever undergraduate lecture was in this room. I'm not telling you how many years ago that was. So we're here to talk about Gaia and Jim Lovelock and where these ideas have gone. And there's lots of important and interesting reasons for doing this, but really the thing that this story brings out is how ideas develop in science. And there's things, when I first read Jim's books on Gaia, that I always didn't understand why anyone had written them down, because for my generation they were taken as given. But it took time and it took effort to get those ideas across. And so I think it's really interesting and it's really important when we talk about science to understand how ideas develop, and it would probably make us better scientists if we considered it more often. So, as you've heard, Chris and Tim they've both got very different voices in this debate and in this story. So Chris is kind of maybe the climate scientist who's a generation above me. Am I allowed to say that?
Two.
He's making faces at me. So he kind of was there as this was happening and saw these ideas develop and saw their impact. And is also obviously very knowledgeable about current climate science. And then Tim is now sort of in a way representing, is the next generation of Jim. Am I allowed to say that?
I hope so.
Am I allowed to say that, Jim? Listening in
Yeah.
on Facebook. So with this idea that is still under discussion in science, and it's still, you know, it sort of sits slightly uneasily in what's going on for some scientists. And I think it's really important in the development of ideas that we talk about all this. So that's what we're going to cover this evening. And so the way this is going to work, we are going to introduce some of these ideas, bring everyone up to speed with what did happen and what is happening. And then as we go along, there'll be more time for questions as we go. We're hoping also to have questions from anyone watching online. So if you're watching online, get on Twitter, get on Facebook, send your questions in. We'll answer what we can. And towards the end, it will become more of a discussion. There is a hashtag for this. Is it up there? There's a hashtag, CCLS 2019. So if you'd like to tweet along, do feel free. And with that, we will begin. And how better to begin than with a description of how Jim Lovelock came to Gaia theory, how it occurred to him. And here is him telling that story. Oh, no, isn't it? Oh, that's very stationary. Let's go back a slide. Come on. We're there.
The job I got, strangely enough, it was one of the first space ventures in Britain. I got a letter from the Director of Spaceflight Operations of NASA asking if I'd joined with them on their exploration of the Moon and Mars. And this was terrific. This was in 1961, before anything of that sort had happened at all. And the reason they asked me, not because I'm a physicist or a space person or anything like that, was that I'd made little bits of apparatus that were very sensitive, could detect and identify all manner of chemicals that might be connected with life. And they were small enough and used very little power and were just the kind of things they wanted to put on their spacecraft, the rovers and Voyagers. And that's how I got involved in it. And the question that was put to me was, how would I detect life on a planet? Well, I mean, it's quite a difficult question when you think about it. And what are you going to do? Look for rhinoceroses or something like that, or cockroaches? There's no simple way, because you don't know what's on Mars. Anyway, there mightn't be anything like that. Was there any general way of detecting life? Well, very fortunately, a famous physicist, Schrödinger, had come up with the idea that if you want to find life, what you look for is a reduction of entropy on the planet. And now entropy is one of those nasty words that they confuse students with. What it means really, it's entropy is disorder. You look for the relative amount of order and disorder on the surface of the planet. If you find that something is happening on the planet that is either putting it in order or the opposite, then that's interesting, and there might be life there. And then, knowing that, then you can start looking for the kind of life that it might be. And it was this that then made me think, well, of course, the Earth's a planet, so why not look at the Earth this way? And see if there's an entropy reduction in the whole of the Earth system, which is caused by the presence of life on the planet. And sure enough, there's a huge entropy reduction in the Earth's atmosphere, for example, to say nothing of the surface and the ocean. And I'll give you an example. For example, if you go up and analyze the gases in the atmosphere, you find there's a mixture of methane and oxygen present. Now this is illogical, because they react together in sunlight, and in a sense they're burning. And this would never happen on a planet with no life. It means that the planet has life on it. And that is very interesting if you're an exobiologist looking for life on other planets. But it interested me from a totally different point of view. What on earth was the Earth doing this for? Why, what was happening? Why? And of course, the more you think about it, the more you find that it has to do with climate. It has to do with the composition of the surface and its effect on life, and so on and so forth.
So he didn't pick that. It's a great introduction to how he got into it, but he didn't say very much about Gaia itself and what that hypothesis was. So Chris is going to fill in that gap.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Excuse my voice, it's not quite prime ministerial, but it's going that way. So it's my job to say a few words about how I first encountered Jim and Gaia, and what I've learned about Jim in particular, and a little bit about Gaia since. So wind back 33 years to the end of 1986. And I was a young researcher in the Mullard Space Science Laboratory, the Space Science Lab of University College London, which is in a lovely old building out in the Surrey Wolds. And we were in a very exciting period. We were helping the European Space Agency, and to some extent NASA Goddard and NASA JPL, develop their ideas about a whole fleet of low Earth orbiting satellites that were going to study the Earth's surface. And so this was very new stuff. There had been a few trial missions. And what we found was that we were opening up a new window on the planet. We actually tried to coin the word macroscope. You use a microscope to study things that are very small compared with you. And the idea was that a macroscope allowed you to study something very big compared with you, the planet. And we were particularly interested in a special instrument, a vertical incidence radar. And this radar didn't discriminate. It was actually designed to operate over the ocean, but it operated perfectly happily over the land, the ice, the inland water, the tropical rainforests. And so we found ourselves analyzing data. It was like being in an Aladdin's cave. Every time we looked into the data, we found something new and wonderful and interesting. Simply to be able to talk to the specialist people who we were providing disruptive new ways of working, we hired a geographer, and I have to say the head of the physics and astronomy department nearly had an apoplexy when he heard that we'd hired a geographer to do that, but I won't get into the old traditions of discriminatory science. So, in December 1986, a colleague of mine, Ian Mason, came into my office and said, have you seen the latest copy of New Scientist? To which I hadn't. He said, there's an article in there that I think you're really going to enjoy. And this is it. This is the original one. So it's pretty faded by now. And there's a lot of yellow markings on here because I looked at it, and the title is Gaia, the World as a Living Organism. Now, I for one reason or another, hadn't bumped into Jim's idea or Jim, but I read that, and then I read the subtitle, As Organisms Grow, They Benefit the Environment as well as themselves. Geophysiological systems thus emerge from the activity of individual organisms. And then the paper goes on, the Earth has remained a comfortable place for living organisms for the whole 3.5 billion years since life began. And essentially Jim was asking the question, well, is that just an enormous piece of luck, given all of the other things that have happened to the planet in that time, or is there something more interesting going on? Is the biology not simply a passenger, but is it actually manufacturing conditions that are suitable for its own long self-interest? So I'm kind of slightly ashamed to admit it, but I do watch The Voice on a Saturday evening. And there are occasions, those of you that don't, this is a program where would-be popular singers try their luck. And the judges, who are aficionados in this, initially sit away and listen to The Voice. And just occasionally, within the first bar, people hit their button and turn around because they instantly say, this individual has something special. And so for me, reading this paper, I more or less hit the button straight away and rotated my chair, because this really, really resonated. Now, why? At its core, you've heard, there's a wonderfully elegant piece of thinking going on. Schrödinger had said, life will leave its mark. If life has invaded a planet, it won't do it by halves. It will have found a way to be there, make its presence felt. And it will use the fluids, the atmosphere and the ocean to both draw in nutrients and to release them, release wastes. And if that happens, the chemical balance of the atmosphere will almost certainly be extremely unusual, not in its rest state. And so what he didn't say in his presentation here was that he was working with NASA. They were figuring out all sorts of ways to discover whether there would be life on Mars. Just one little anecdote he told me once, and he may not ever remember telling me. He said, you know, he said, one of the people I was working with in NASA said very secretively, "Psst, come and have a look what I've got." And so Jim went, and he'd got a tiny little spring trap. And Jim said to him, well, why have you got that? He said, it's to catch the small insects that will be running around on the surface of Mars. And Jim thought, you know, that's not probably the best way to do this. You know, fleas on Mars, well. So Jim said, you know what, if we look at the atmosphere, we'll tell. And he went and looked at some infrared spectra that the French astronomers had got, and went back cheerfully to NASA and said, don't bother with going to Mars, the atmosphere's dead, there's no life there. But they had a big program of satellites, so they quietly said, well, look, Jim, you keep your ideas to yourself, but we're going to fly these things anyway. So that's a whole other thread. So why I probably couldn't have articulated this at the time, but why did this paper and subsequent readings have such a big impact? Well, firstly, it's the big thinking. This is asking big, elegant, fundamental questions, and it's an antidote to reductionism. The way science is these days, to make your mark, everybody has to have become a greater and greater specialist of less and less. And there are many examples of scientists who routinely kind of polish their PhD thesis for all of their career. There are probably 5 people in the rest of the world who understand and have esteem for what it is they're doing. And that's very frustrating to some of us who always want to put the picture together. Let's take all the pieces and see how, when we put the jigsaw together, what's the picture that emerges? And so this was written by somebody who deeply understood that curious motivation. What is the big picture here? It's also an antidote to objectivation. Schrödinger, who in 1956 gave a series of lectures in Trinity, announced 2 principles of science. One was the assumption that nature is understandable, but secondly, that in order to make progress, you need to objectify it. You need to withdraw the observer, in a sense, assuming that what you're observing is true even if the observer is not there. And although it seems to be an important process by which you can come to conclusions about the patterns, the underlying laws of nature, it introduces problems. Descartes understood this, and to this day, we still suffer from this. And if we have time later on, I can explain a little bit about why this is still problematical now. But what Jim did, by talking about Gaia as a superorganism, the Earth, thinking of the Earth as a live creature, whether you accept it or not, just thinking of it that way, put the soul back into science. It connected reality, our spirituality. It connected us, living things, with this objectified object of study. And that's very, very important. And that, of course, is why it attracted a lot of New Age interest and attracted interest from a much, much broader audience than the science community. And, of course, it's also why many members of the science community felt very nervous or dismissive of it, because this objectification, this removal of the human element of science, which is all a myth because scientists are incredibly passionate. You know, they pretend they're like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, you know, being very, very logical. Actually, they're very passionate people. And so this myth that there's some separation between that human element and the science is indeed a myth, and Jim just confronted that head on. So that was why it was attractive too. Thirdly, it's an antidote to causality. The human brain tends to think linearly. The ball moves because we kicked it. But I had come across, prior to Jim, I'd come across an American scientist called Jay Forrester, who in the 70s had published a paper called The Counterintuitive Behavior of Social Systems. And his opening words were, "The human mind is not adapted to interpreting how social systems behave. Such systems belong to a class of multi-loop nonlinear feedback systems with cascades and connections, with all sorts of exchanges going on. In the long history of evolution, it's not been necessary until very recently for people to understand complex systems, and we're not very good at it." Now, I'd say that Brexit and the relationship between Britain and Europe is a wonderful example of not understanding the complex interactions of these sorts of systems. And what Jay Forrester said was that at last the digital computer model allows us to break into these and begin to play with them and begin to understand whether something that may seem to be causal, we do something over here and something over there happens, may not be behaving in the way we think it is at all. And then finally, I sensed a kindred spirit. I started as an experimental physicist building instruments to fly on rockets and satellites, actually to study the cosmos and the sun, and then decided turning them over to look at the Earth was just as interesting and probably more useful. And Jim, as you've heard, sees himself first and foremost as an inventor, somebody who builds these wonderful instruments that have made enormous differences to our ability to detect small concentrations of chemicals in the environment and so on. So those were part of the reasons why I think I was resonating with him. Now, I really wanted to go and see him and talk to him, but I was actually embarrassed. I had no reason to do so until 1994, when I was appointed as director of the International Geosphere Biosphere Programme. Now, this was a program that was built on the sorts of premises that Jim had been thinking about, the interconnectedness of the biology, the chemistry, the physics of the world. And indeed, Jim had been very much one of the kind of founding fathers, the thinkers behind it. So with that appointment made, I contacted Jim, and my wife Norma and I went down in our little red sports car to Coombe Mill and met Jim and Sandy. The red sports car was a kind of middle-age crisis with a long non-Gaussian tail, because I still own it, actually. But anyway, so we met there, and Jim and Sandy and Norma and I hit it off, and I think it's fair to say, I hope Jim wouldn't disagree, that we've really been friends ever since. So what have I learned about Jim in that 25 years? We've worked on and off on lots of interesting things. So one, at core, as I've said, he's an inventor. Engineer doesn't capture it. He develops instruments, but he doesn't just develop them, he uses them, and uses them in brilliant ways. So he's an instrumentalist. So whether he's addressing chemistry, physics, biology, human biology, if you read his biography, you'll see what an extraordinary range of science he's studied. He's fundamentally an instrumentalist. And at Coombe Mill, he used to grin and say, there are no health and safety people down here, which is quite scary, actually, because so he was very interested in explosions at one point. So anyway, so secondly, he's a scientist. There's no doubt about that. He's a fellow of the Royal Society, has a distinguished career of published papers. And of course, scientists are explorers, so he's a discoverer driven by curiosity. Thirdly, though, he's a thinker. And thinkers are different. There are lots of people who are instrumentalists, there are lots of people who are scientists, but he's a deep thinker. And thinkers reveal deep truths. And talking to Jim years ago, I said to him, because he's been an independent scientist for many, many years, I said, what do you think is the greatest advantage of being an independent scientist? And he said, well, Chris, he said, I can get up in the morning and I can either sit around or go for a walk, but I can think uninterrupted for 8 hours or more, and sometimes it takes 8 hours of thinking to allow something to gestate and think it through. And there are very few people in professional science who really have 8 hours of uninterrupted thinking to them. That's something that is very special. So a couple more things. He's a writer. He's a communicator. If you've read his books, you will know that. I just picked one at random a couple of hours ago on the train coming up here, and I found this straight away. Do not be misled by the lulls in climate change. In the real world, change is rarely smooth. It goes by fits and starts, more like the halting progress of a traffic jam than the easy motion of the open road. What a beautiful metaphor, something that all of us know. We've all been stuck on the motorway with these funny waves of stop-start that go through. But what a lovely way of expressing something that's profound and real. So he's a communicator. He's an advocate. He's been advocating for a long time. You know what? We really need to do something about climate change. It really threatens our well-being. The planet, of course, is indifferent. And finally, the thing I think that probably attracts me to him as much as anything is that he's a maverick. I'm not sure whether it's Carl Sagan or Schneider who called him a mischievous intellect. And he is. I remember seeing a TV program of him once years ago, and the interviewer said to him, "What things surprise you?" He's out in the country somewhere, and he said, "Oh, this." And he said, "Do you realize the complexity of the cybernetics that allows me to hop like that?" Well, in science, as in anything, there are lots of people who take themselves far too seriously. My money goes for somebody who hops on TV. I think that tells you a lot. So I think with that, we can talk a little bit more about Gaia as the evening moves on. We're now going to see 3 more clips from Jim, but I just want to tell you 2 more brief anecdotes, 2 quick ones. When I was director of the Science Museum, I kept in close correspondence with Jim, and Jim took a very close interest in what we were doing there, because as much to him, as much to me, as much to many, many scientists in the UK, the Science Museum has had a formative impression on us as children, as has the Royal Institution, for example. And Jim sent me an email at one point, and he said, "When you're doing all of these changes, Chris, don't forget the SBN." So I thought, SBN. So in the end, I gave up, and I sent him an email, said, "Sorry, Jim, what is the SBN?" He said, "The small bespectacled nerd." He said, "When I was a young boy, I used to skive off school, and I had so much fun and learned so much and was so inspired by the dark corners of the Science Museum where I poked around and found stuff that the majority of people weren't finding." So respect and help the small bespectacled nerd. And then the other thing is that Jim has had Jim will say a lot about, a lot of his thinking comes because he's still rural and not urban. Until quite recently, he would go for a couple of mile walk every morning. When I used to go down there, he was the one who was striding along and I was the one panting behind him. And he sent me another very excited email a couple of years ago, and it said, Chris, I was out on my walk this morning and I got bitten by an adder, and its fangs were 2.73 centimetres apart. And its venom didn't do anything to me at all. So with that, we're probably time to go on and let Jim do some of the talking. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Just before we watch the videos, small contribution from Jim, I just wanted to add something, to pick up on something that Chris said about the context for Gaia when it first came along. Because if you heard, a lot of this came along in the era of early satellites, and it is something we absolutely take for granted now that we know what our planet looks like, because we are bombarded with images, even on the weather forecast. There's pictures of our planet. We grow up now, kids now grow up knowing exactly what our planet looks like. But back in the 50s and 60s, we knew much less about the planet. Earth observation as a science was much, much newer. And you think about all the ice cores, the genetic techniques, and all these things now, the huge amount of science we've done in the decades that came along since then. This was very raw material he was working with. And there were all these complications that they had no way of measuring, no way of dealing with it. And this was humanity just starting to grapple with that idea, just being able to see it. And I think that's one of the reasons that Gaia was picked up on quite so much. So now, as Chris said, we've got 3 videos of Jim, short videos, talking about various aspects of Gaia. Because you do start to talk about Gaia almost as a person, actually. It's very hard not to. I've got a friend called Gaia as well. Anyway, so here we go. Oh, no, we don't. I think this clicker just doesn't like me.
The Gaia concept, the idea that we live on a planet that is itself alive and regulates itself. Yes, well, this is an idea that I think most ordinary people had before science came along. And then scientists came along and said, oh, nonsense, no, not live at all. How could it be? You don't see rocks moving around and winking at each other and things like that. And so in a way it died. And I think we've lost a lot as a result of that. It's less romantic, I think, to think of the Earth as absolutely dead, just a pile of rocks and water and stuff.
No, it doesn't. You know what? So these chairs, right, they make me feel like I ought to have a white cat because I'm king of the universe, and then I pick up the clicker and it does not think I'm king of the universe.
An unfortunate mistake that happened in teaching long, long ago, probably as far back as Aristotle, and that is of teaching things that happen on the Earth and the existence of things as a matter of cause and effect. It's the cause and effect. And sort of thinking of it in terms of geometry and so on, instead of thinking of it as alive. And well, I suppose you couldn't expect them to think of it as alive unless you put the idea in their heads. Well, I suppose that's my job, really. If you think of the Earth as just a piece of rock that happens to be moistened with water, and remarkably little water, really, and it's got air, very thin air that you breathe on it. If you think of it as no more than that, you don't really have a picture of this vivid, wonderful, live thing that you happen to inhabit. It's perfectly true to say that as a living entity, Gaia, if it really is, and I'm right, it likes it cool or cold. And to give you an example of this, if the sea temperature at the surface rises above 15 degrees Celsius, it's not very hot. There's very little life in it. And that is why when you go to the tropics, places like that, the sea is beautifully blue and it's clear and you can see right down to 100 meters or something like that. The reason you can do that is there's no life in it to absorb light or anything like that. And indeed, you could say that the ocean in the central part, the equatorial part of the Earth, is more of a desert than the Sahara is. There's less life per square mile or whatever unit you want to use. We were once very surprised. We went to Cambridge to see Chris Rapley, who I think is involved with some of this thing. And he showed us some fish that were swimming at 1.5 degrees below freezing in salt water. And they were swimming around, and they were full of life, and they would come and pick up a morsel of food from your finger if you put it in.
Speculate on that next time you think it's cold in Cambridge. So Gaia had... One of the interesting things about scientific theories, of course, is that the bigger ones don't just stay frozen. And if you read through the series of books that Jim wrote, the first one and the most recent one are actually quite different in the slant they take. And there's the same basic idea, but the idea has developed. And I think that's one of the things that is perhaps less understood about this, is that it wasn't one thing that was spoken in 1968 or 72 or whenever it was, and then it just stayed. It became a fossil immediately. That's not how it's worked out. And so now we're going to hear from Tim, because he's one of the people that has taken these ideas and taken them on, and can perhaps tell us where they're going next.
So I need to take you back to autumn 1991, when I was a first-year undergraduate natural scientist here, Robinson College. We were living amidst the realization of the ozone hole, of the destruction of the Amazon, we were out waving placards against the World Trade Organization and the proposed global agreement on trades and tariffs. You know, I was part of a generation who were sensitized to global environmental, social issues. And I was also a little bit of a depressed first year Nat Ski. To be honest, there was something missing in the way I was being taught here. I hate to confess in these hallowed halls. And I went back home for Christmas rather miserable. And my dad, who was a scientist, a plant hormone biochemist, gave me Jim's first 2 books as a Christmas present. And they just connected with me at that particular moment in my own sort of formative years, I guess. I was passionate about science, and I was already passionate about the Earth and about these issues that were unfolding around me, and his work just clicked. And at the end of his second book, which is the one, The Ages of Gaia, if I'm allowed to say so, I think his best, he sort of ends it saying, you know, we need some kind of medicine or physiology for the planet. Is there a doctor out there? ? And I thought, well, this is captivating. I think I found the thing I want to work on. I'll write Jim Lovelock a letter, which I duly did. And being the man he is, he replied. He heard from this unknown kid, 18-year-old, living up the road in Nailsea near Bristol, and said, "Oh, why don't you come down and come and pay me a visit?" So at the end of my first year here, I was back home. I, borrowed the mum or dad's car, pottled down to Combe Mill where Jim and Sandy used to live, and we just got chatting. We hit it off, and from there, I think he gifted me the journey I'm still on, which is really to get into, to try to develop this science that he's gifted us. So in this first book, there are some extraordinary revelations at least for me as the young scientist. It's the first time I'd been confronted with the extraordinary transformation of the planet that had happened due to life, and the fact that I could only be here breathing an oxygen-rich atmosphere because of the activities of billions of years of cyanobacteria, algae, and now plants. Yes, I mentioned, we hit it off early on. That's an early shot together. And by the time I was in my final year here, Jim was good enough to invite me along to one of these meetings he and Sandy were convening in Oxford through the 1990s. So if you look carefully, you won't just see me in the middle somewhere and Jim down there, but a whole raft of famous figures in this story. And I got lucky. I started, thanks to Jim's influence, I started working on a PhD in this area with a guy called Andy Watson, who sat on the front row. And I guess what you want to do as a scientist is understand how the world works, right? And in the case of Gaia, at one level, what we were trying to do was understand the actual mechanisms by which life was involved in self-regulating the cycling of all the resources it needed, including the oxygen level of the atmosphere, the nutrient levels in the ocean, the temperature of the planet. That's one level of understanding, and one that I kind of try to continue to pursue. But there's another question that Gaia raises, which is, how did those mechanisms come to be here or to predominate now? Why hasn't life driven the planet off into an inhospitable state? Why does it appear to be the case that these self-regulating mechanisms, as Jim described them, have not only arisen, but they've accumulated on the planet? I mean, it feels like an evolutionary mechanism must be at play. But Jim and Lynn, famously put the Gaia hypothesis out there. But the Jim Lovelock I met in the 1980s or the 1990s had just been through a decade of being hammered over the head by characters like these chaps on the right, Richard Dawkins at the bottom and a chap called W4 Doolittle up there, who are leading evolutionary thinkers who had basically been battering Jim over the head with the fact that there's no way Gaia, the Earth system, whatever you want to call it, can be self-regulating because it's been refined by natural selection. They rightly pointed out that there isn't a population of planets producing offspring in which the ones that regulate a little bit better produce more offspring and so on. That's a sort of an unworkable mechanism for the planet. And they used their sort of weddedness to their own favourite theory in a sense to reject the hypothesis. But some of us didn't reject it, and we've been asking ourselves ever since, well, what kind of evolutionary mechanism is at play here if we accept that the Earth not only has one self-regulating mechanism, it has many, and they've been accumulating over time. So the thing I'm still working on, and I published something about even last year, was beginning to explain what we've come in the recent decades to understand about what you might call simpler or cruder selection mechanisms that can select for stabilizing outcomes at a planetary or biosphere scale. At the same time, it's worth saying that natural selection, there's no conflict here with the beloved Darwinian theory of natural selection, and we'd be in trouble if there was. And it's actually very helpful if we try to explain how do we see nutrient cycling around us in the world everywhere. Well, one organism's waste becoming another organism's food can be a perfectly natural product of Darwinian selection. But when you go up the scales, as I'm trying to sketch here, and you go up to the planetary scale and billion-year timescales, you can't invoke natural selection to explain what's going on there. But instead, we now think we're getting an understanding of how the dynamics of a system as complex as the Earth, it kind of goes through a series of experiments thanks to the innovations of life. And sometimes it finds stability and sometimes it doesn't. But crucially, when it finds stability, that tends to persist. And once it's found one stable configuration, that little bit of extra persistence gives it a chance to acquire another stabilizing mechanism that'll make it persist even longer, and so on. And that's what we're still working on right now, is to unpack some of the what we think is new theory there that can explain what's going on. The last thing I wanted to say, though, is Jim got a battering before and since I met him over the idea that his hypothesis, Gaia, implied some kind of conscious foresight or purposive behaviour on the part of unconscious living things. And he went to extraordinary lengths before I met him in the 1980s to invent a model called Daisy World to illustrate to people that a planetary scale system of life in its environment could come to regulate temperature completely automatically. There was no need to invoke a sort of reflection, a consciousness, a foresight, a purpose. But for me, the irony of the situation we're all finding ourselves in today is that as humans, we have kind of collectively woken up to the Earth system or Gaia consequences of our actions. We're busy monitoring and modelling that. And some of us have already started to consciously change our actions in response to that information, to cycle more, to drive less, to fly less, whatever it is. And that is teleological feedback. That is the thing that Jim had to purge from the pre-human Gaia. It's back with abundance with us, and that's what I decided to call Gaia 2.0, the idea that we might be able to add a little bit of self-awareness to the Earth's self-regulation. We might use our collective awareness of the consequences of our actions to, if you like, feed back on our own behaviour and not just blindly march into the climate apocalypse. Now, I've been helped in this kind of thinking, interestingly, by both Jim and by someone else who's been inspired by Jim, who's a non-scientist, but a great philosopher and sociologist of science, which is that guy, Bruno Latour. And what he rightly reminded me and chastised me for as a scientist was there's no such thing as this dislocated brain down the bottom there, Tim. And it makes you want to ask some questions if you even take this idea on board. Who are the humans playing this role in this possible conscious regulation? What sort of consciousness can we expect of them, or rather us? And for me, the really interesting question scientifically, what things could we learn from the prior Gaia that would teach us something about how to construct a sustainable, flourishing future for us and for all our future generations? So that's where I've got to in now about 28 years.
So just to pick up on a few things there. So there's a question. So I want us to be really clear here, because it's sometimes hard with these ideas to keep track of all the different bits. And I just wanted to ask you to be super clear about one point, which I think is quite important, which is that we have very commonly now, a phrase you hear is Earth system science. In fact, you are a professor of it now. And to me, an example, so I work at the ocean surface, right? And I cannot study what I study, breaking waves and bubbles, without studying biology, chemistry, large-scale things, small-scale things. It comes, if you're going to study that environment, things interact. There are feedbacks all over the place. You know, this causes that, causes that. There are complicated consequences. And what I'd like you to be really clear about is how is Gaia, either the first or the second version, different? Just from a system which, you know, it's finely balanced, it's in equilibrium, these things are all, you know, feed in and out of each other. It can just be like that. Why do you need something else?
Well, the first thing to say is we wouldn't have Earth system science if we hadn't had Jim Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis. It predates any such notions. So in many ways, as Jim used to put it, the Earth system or Earth system science is just a scientifically correct name for Gaia. It is true that there was a separate tradition that Chris will know well as well, that grew and came interestingly out of NASA in the 1980s, where they started to define and identify this thing called Earth system science. They wrote a committee wrote a seminal report about it in the 1980s. And they got as far as recognizing that this was a system with lots of interacting parts, including a human part. They don't actually say anything about feedbacks in that report. They certainly don't say anything about self-regulation. As Chris well knows, by the time we got to 2001, the organization Chris mentioned that he was leading for a long time and other global change organizations came together and made a statement, the Amsterdam Declaration on Global Change, where they got as far as saying the Earth behaves as a self-regulating system, but they stopped short of saying what its goal function is, what is it regulating towards, and that's as close as Earth system science has got to Gaia. In the case of Gaia, the simple answer is its goal is to maintain habitable conditions for the flourishing of life. So, of course, ideas can emerge from slightly different quarters, blend and get very close to each other. But for me, crucially, to start with, it all starts with Gaia, and crucially, Gaia puts the emphasis on the agency of life. I like to think of it as all of these other living things, bacteria or whatever, are free agents just trying to create their own conditions for survival and flourishing. And we're in some, as Lovelock put it, very democratic collective with those other creatures. And the remarkable thing about the network of life is it's been able to extend itself in space from presumably starting in a pond somewhere at the smallest scale to the global scale, and in time to 3.8 billion years so far. And Gaia, for me, is that extraordinary network of those agents extending themselves in space and time, not just a mechanical, quasi-cybernetic system of complex feedback, because life is all about information, it's about evolution, it's about learning from experience, and that's what you miss, Helen, if all you have are just the mechanics.
Yeah,
just add something in. I think the real distinction, you find the world tends to divide, doesn't it, between broadly what you might call soft Gaians, that is people who accept that the world is a hugely complex interactive system where the biology isn't just a passenger, it plays a formative role. And that next step, the brave step, the extraordinary step that Jim took to say it is alive, it is the superorganism. We step back from it, and there it is, sitting there, this little pearl in the darkness of space. And of course, Helen, you were talking about the impact of the early pictures from space, but the Apollo 8 astronauts, as they came over the horizon of the dead moon, very, very dead indeed, saw this extraordinary blue object arising.
And in fact, that was 50 years ago, just in December this year, Bill Anders, Earthrise, that picture.
And I think they articulated the view that it was alive. It was the thing that distinguished it was the colour, the dynamics, but it was a living object. And Jim draws the analogy between a redwood tree where 99.9% of the material is dead, but there is a whole ecosystem of life going on in the trunk and so on. And it seems to me, and the reason that Lynn Margulis is so wonderful was that she realized that the early symbiosis of microbial life packed itself up. And what I love about it, again, because she's mischievous, or she's passed away now, but the mischievous idea that the eukaryotes are laughing at us because we're great lumbering packages of them, which are delivering them down into the future. We are their evolutionary vehicle. And it's interesting.
If you've ever wondered what your gut microbiome is doing for
exactly.
you,
So you are you are a great mass of lumbering eukaryotes, and they're laughing at you because you're...
So a eukaryote, sorry, we should be clear here, is a multicellular organism such as ourselves, which is quite complicated, which carries all these little things inside it.
But you see, it's interesting that I'm doing a lot of work on human behavior at present, and asking the question, why is it that humanity is finding it so difficult to respond to threatening issues like climate change? And it's fascinating that as you get deeper into the neuroscience and the psychology, the model of a human being, it appeals to a physicist, particularly one who knows Schrödinger. It's like a wave-particle dualism. We are both at once individuals and we are social animals. And unless you model both of those things simultaneously, you do not capture the way that humans behave in bulk. And you can extend that and think about ant colonies and termite colonies and so on, where the individual becomes absorbed into a larger organism. So actually, it's almost like a kind of false distinction that so upset the established science community when Jim had the temerity to say this object is alive. It is alive by a sensible definition, but by a very simplistic definition, you may find yourself troubled by it. I think that understanding, as I say, reintroduced the soul. It reintroduced a connection that Jim makes the point, country people who live their lives in the natural world, don't find so difficult, but we urbanites find a difficult thing to absorb.
Well, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because the problem with the phrase "it is alive" is not actually about the alive bit, it's about what it is.
Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to pick up on that, though, that just before we get to questions, so we're going to have a bit of time for questions in a second, but before we get that, I'd just like both of your opinions on one thing, which is that it's very clear, I think, that the impact that Gaia had, both when it came along and since, comes in two forms. And you can separate them if you're being a reductionist scientist, which may be my hat for the evening. And you can say, well, one is a scientific hypothesis, which tells you how to look at the links and the interactions and all of this. And the other one is just that it's an idea. It's a relationship that we can have with our surroundings. And maybe if the hypothesis itself doesn't hold up from a strict scientific point of view, however you define that, maybe it's still useful as an emotional idea. What are both of your reactions to that?
Wholehearted agreement in the sense that I don't think we have any hope collectively as a species unless we can recognise the miracle of our existence here after 3.8 billion years of life, and that if we can't go out into the natural world and feel the emotive connection that we're only here because of these other living things and many past generations of them, and literally since that, then I don't think we're going to find the inner drive that it's going to take to get off the trajectory we're on and to build, to be honest, to be a positive part of a future Gaia.
Because the thing that's implicit in what you just said is that the trajectory we're just on might be what blows Gaia apart, because if we ruin it, maybe it's not self-regulating. Hold that thought. Emotions and the scientific hypothesis.
It just goes back to what I was saying earlier. So if you talk to subarctic peoples, reindeer herders and so on, we had a conference a few years ago where we had many elders. They, for thousands, at least 1,000 years, have lived in a sustainable way in an extremely harsh and difficult environment. And the only reason they've been able to do that is by finding its rhythms and working with the grain of the environment, understanding its deep rhythms, and having a respect for it. Pacific Islanders who travelled across the Pacific in canoes, even when they reached the island, retained a canoe view of the world. That is, when you're on a canoe in the middle of the Pacific, you need to conserve your water and your food and your energy and so on. And an island is just a big canoe. So there's a sort of deep understanding that you need to work with the rhythm of nature. But look at us in the West. The reason that there is such a strong backlash, or one of the reasons, towards the climate change threat, is that it threatens neoliberalism and the powerful economies and economic theories which see the environment as something to be plundered, not something to be, something that's a free good. We're all pumping our CO2 into the atmosphere. We're not paying a penny for the damage that we're causing. So the economic system, which drives is the powerhouse of the modern world, completely excludes the environment in the respectful way that it needs to be taken. And so you ask yourself, is the environment part of the economy or the economy part of the environment? Well, you can't eat money. It's absolutely obvious what the truth of the answer is, but the entire world functions as if it was the other way around. So this is why the sort of thinking that Jim introduces is profound in many different ways. People who've read Chief Seattle's speech, if you look it up, although it's...
Keep it quite short.
Yes, okay. I was just going to say, Chief Seattle said, we're all part of the web of life. Anything you do to the web, we do to ourselves. And that's the thinking which is inherent in seeing the world as a living organism, of which we are an integral part. And so it's a powerful doorway into a sustainable future if we really internalize what Jim has been saying. If we don't, then we're on a hiding to a very rough ride, which is, of course, what he called his last book.
Okay, we'll take some questions now before we carry on to even more ideas. If you've got a question, please keep it short. Make sure it's a question and not a comment. That would be great. If you've got a question, please stick your hands up. Someone with a microphone will come round and give you a microphone. Someone over there, I can see.
Hello. I started off myself with science and ended up as a Buddhist teacher. So I'm very interested in the whole area around consciousness and so on. So I'm glad to hear that some scientists actually bring back consciousness into the whole system of science and so on. So I have two questions. The first one is, as scientists can see how complex all systems are, as they call it, is there a notion that everything could be interconnected, which is actually part of human wisdom for thousands of years? Secondly, Jim mentioned Aristotle, and as far as I understand it, with Aristotle, that split between rational thinking, and you could call it the imagination and spirituality and so on, started. So do you think it's time to bring the two together again?
So one thing I should have added is you're allowed one question each, but we'll let the two go. Okay, so interconnectedness and Aristotle. Any response?
Well, we certainly study Gaia or the Earth system as fundamentally interconnected in all kinds of ways as a given now, and I certainly do. As for the history of Western thought, I went to comprehensive school, so I lack a bit of the early training, but I did take history and philosophy of science here at Cambridge. That helped me out a bit. And what I learned is in the Greeks, there was the oikos and the polis, and the oikos, which is sort of what we've run with, Aristotle and so forth, presumed that there was a preordained order to the world. There was a house, a household. There was a sort of patriarchy in the household, and that's the model we've run with, following Aristotle. But I think this is in Plato, and in Plato writing about Socrates, there's also the polis, which is where the beings, people in that case, have to work out how to govern themselves, how to organize a city in that case. And wouldn't it be an interesting and different way of being if you had a little bit more emphasis on the latter, perhaps? That's the way I'm starting to think about it. And maybe it's one way to look at how the bacteria and everything else in Gaia interact. They sort of unconsciously work out a way of governing themselves. So, yeah, we're certainly at the far end of a very long journey in a line of philosophical thought in the West. But as you rightly say, we don't have to stray too far around the planet to find a completely different tradition of thought that's perhaps an awful lot better aligned to the Lovelockian or the Gaia thinking.
And just to chip in on the interconnectedness, like I spent this afternoon looking at a pile of data from the summer which was biological and chemical and physical, and discussing that with colleagues, and there are no boundaries. These are things that are interlinked, and there is absolutely no question. Like we know we can't study any of those things now without studying all of them. So it's not even it's not a debate anymore. Actually, the interconnectedness. Do you have anything to contribute?
Just make a couple of comments. For me, it's the difference between a kind of sum of physics and ecology. Physics got a long way by isolating elements of the real world around us, doing first-order models and then perturbing them to begin to take into account the complexity. So there's an old joke that a physicist's model of a cow is a 2-meter sphere, which they might paint black and white and allow methane to leak out of. But with ecology, you have to study the complexity. As soon as you start to try and isolate pieces and remove bits, you've lost what it is you're studying. And Earth system science, or Gaia, is the ultimate ecological collection because it encompasses everything. The only other thing I would say is that have been learning a lot in the last 5 years, working with neuroscientists and psychosociologists and clinical psychiatrists and narrative specialists about how people make sense of the world. And I have to admit, my neuroscientist colleagues sort of fell about laughing when I explained what I thought my Mark I Paleolithic brain was doing. But as a physicist, I assumed it was trying to build an ever more accurate model of the world around me. And of course, they fell about and said, oh, good God, that's not what evolution delivered you. It delivered you something that provides you with meaning and context. It provides you with signals and reactions that try and maximize your benefit and minimize your disbenefit. And as soon as you understand that, and there are wonderful examples where you can show that a particular scene where the hue, color, and intensity of various patches in the scene are absolutely identical. So a physical instrument would say these two are the same, but in the context of a scene, the brain automatically differentiates them because it's important to understand what the intrinsic color of a thing is, whether it's in shade or not, rather than the actual signal on the retina. So when you begin to understand what our Paleolithic Mark I brain is doing, then you begin to understand where it fails, where it's clever, and begin to understand why it is that our relationship with other humans in the planet is as complex and difficult as it is.
I would like to make a point here about reductionist science, because I think it's these two things are not necessarily conflicting, and the point is we need both. Reductionist science has allowed enormous progress to be made in isolating and identifying behaviour that allows you to pick apart what is doing this thing here. But the point is that those are only the jigsaw pieces, I think, and that this has to be then built up again. We've got another question, maybe somewhere on this side, at the back over there somewhere. Yeah. One question. We're having one question.
Yeah, there's one question, but for all three of you, if possible.
Go ahead.
So between complicity and complacency, which do you think is more of an influence on the exacerbation of climate collapse?
Are we complicit or are we complacent? What do we think about that?
Probably a bit of both. Do you mean in terms of the unsustainable way in which humanity is behaving? Or?
Well, I mean, in terms of the influence that actually has. Like, if we say, for example, climate skepticism isn't actually that much of an influence because the only country where it has the one party in the government is visibly skeptical about the climate is the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, and every other nation isn't. Is it enough? I mean, we're not all complicit to that scale. We're not all complacent to certain levels. So I'm just asking, which do you think has more of an influence?
I don't think we have a huge amount of choice about being complicit in the strictest sense, because unless you go and live on a mountain and completely isolate yourself from absolutely everything, we are a collective, and I think, not that we want to talk about Brexit, but I think Chris's point about understanding interactions and the value of what we need other people, that has definitely been lost. And it's been lost because our pattern-fitting brains like stories with heroes and villains.
I think that there are lots of things that we could say here. There is a danger that there's been a strong trend towards individualism and the sort of right of the individual to behave the way they wish, regardless of what damage they may do, which they may not be aware of. But I think more generally, I get very nervous when the language begins to edge towards what can become a tyranny. You know, I've given talks on climate change, and I've had people from the audience come up afterwards and say, I heard you flew on an airplane last week. To which the answer is, well, yes, I did. I interrogated my conscience. I thought very carefully about it. I have not flown on aircraft when I might have done recently. But in the end, it's up to every individual to make their own decision, and it must not become a tyranny. If we all start pointing fingers at each other, then that is not going to help. But none of us would wish to be in a high-carbon world now that we know what the consequences are. But it was completely unwitting. People didn't deliberately go out and toss, large quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere. It didn't seem to be a problem until science revealed it. But now that science has revealed it, then we need a sensible, civil, proper discussion about how we work together to find a way forward. We're not trying to blame anybody. So we are complicit, but we mustn't try and apportion blame. It's not helpful. We simply need to recognise what the issue is and be sensible about finding the most the most beneficial way forward. After all, the fossil fuels that we've burned, look at the lives that we lead. I mean, the quality of life that a very large fraction of humanity, unfortunately not all of humanity, leaves, is remarkable.
Anything to add, Tim?
I think, for me, if we're going to avoid the worst of what I would call the coming climate tipping points, then we've left it late enough now that we're going to have profound transformative change in our social, ecological, technological, economic space. And that's the position we've collectively put ourselves in, and not entirely unknowingly or complacently. And for me, it's time to take some lessons from a very long-lived and successful flourishing of life in the form of Gaia to accelerate the transition to a societies powered by sustainable energy and built on, in the broadest terms, the recycling of all the material resources they need, and to change the way in which in the priority in which information flows through society, rather than from being restricted in a hierarchical structure, to build much more networked and horizontal information flows to accelerate this transition. Because if we don't do it, we're on the way out this century.
So I want to go back to the question that I asked you before and then stopped you answering, which is that if Gaia is a viable theory, how do you reconcile that with the climate destruction that we are currently wreaking on ourselves? Or is this just Gaia's way of getting rid of us?
Well, I've written a book with Andy Watson, my friend, on what we called the revolutions that made the Earth, which is to recognise that we're actually only here because of a very few, very rare, extraordinary times of sort of tipping point change in the history of the planet, where some new biological innovation, like oxygen production, completely changed the world. And it must have been an extraordinarily tumultuous time when it did. And for me, it might well be the case that we may be in the midst of one of these extraordinary and rare revolutions. The reason why we can disrupt the system is partly because it's unusually unstable at the moment, and the Ice Age cycles show us that. They show us a planet that's extraordinarily sensitive to fairly small changes in the Earth's orbit, and turn that into an extraordinary oscillation over hundreds of thousands of years with 150-metre changes in sea level and 5 degrees changes in the Earth's temperature. So we come along, bizarrely, at a time when I would say Gaia is unusually unstable, and we hit the system, and we're hitting it far faster than the mechanisms that have evolved to date were designed, or not designed, but rather evolved to cope with, pardon my teleology. So, I mean, we still can thank the biosphere for taking half of every year's carbon emissions straight back out of the atmosphere, because the problem would be twice as bad and going twice as quickly if it wasn't. But we're doing things so quickly that we're overriding what has evolved thus far. And that puts the ball in our court. If you want to wait for the naturally evolved mechanisms to deal with the mess we're making, it's going to be a tumultuous and long and painful wait, and I'm not sure we'll get to see the end of it. So the option is we choose to regulate, we choose to do things differently, or we suffer the consequences of not taking that on board.
So on that note, because the name of this year's Cambridge Climate Lecture Series, the question asked is, can we fix it? I want to skip forward to something that Jim recorded for us on, not that one, this one.
Oh.
Geoengineering is quite simply engineering the Earth. It's a practical way that we can take ourselves to undo some of the harm that is being done as a result of global warming. And it's not a bad idea at all. Nobody's quite sure how practical it is. But assuming that it works, for example, there was that famous H-bomb scientist Teller invented a way. He didn't only invent bombs. He did other things that were more useful. He introduced the idea of a mesh screen, just a fine mesh, very fine indeed, that was spun out by its own centrifugal forces somewhere in between the Earth and the Sun, and held in position by rockets in the way that the geosynchronous satellites get your television programs and things to you. And that would deflect a portion, a tiny, percent or so of the sunlight away into space, and that of course would cool the Earth. So it's a lovely idea. I'm not sure, I have no notion how practical it is, whether NASA could do it for us or not, but there you are. I mean, that's a typical bit of geoengineering. Another one is to spray fine particles in the atmosphere that reflect the sunlight back to space, which is similar in many ways.
Some people are passionately against the idea of geoengineering. They say, it's more technology. Technology got us into this mess. Why would you use more to get us? How would you reply to those kinds of?
I'd be a bit disgusted by anybody who said that. It's not that, it's how much does it cost. If it's not an expensive operation, I mean, if that spinning disc can easily be put up there by NASA, and think of all the other things that are sent up into space, why not? And it works, it does this well, then do it. It's going to save an awful lot. Crop yields will increase, all sorts of things will get better. And so no, I've nothing against the idea. If, on the other hand, it's desperately expensive and you've got to lose heavily by doing it, well, then you wouldn't do it. It's just, to me, this is a matter of common sense rather than science.
So, now this is a cat among the pigeons topic, but we'll dig into it a little bit, because as Tim has said, if you take this idea to its logical conclusion, and you have the knowledge and you have the ability, what do you do? So I will throw my hat in the ring here and say what I think most current Earth scientists would say, which is that the problem with geoengineering is not necessarily doing it, it's the unintended consequences. We've done lots of things already that had lots of unintended consequences. And if you just create another one, you've probably got a cascade of more unintended consequences, and we really don't need any more. So that's one of the reasons for the caution on behalf of a lot of climate scientists. But there are also modelers. If you look at the current, the projections for what will happen with our current input, extra carbon dioxide and methane actually now into the atmosphere, there are people who say, well, we'll never turn this round without doing something else. Carbon capture is one thing, but can that ever be enough? So this is one of those hot topics, and of course the problem is that it's all about collective. Geoengineering isn't something that a country can do or a region can do. It's something that we either all do or we all don't do. So what's Gaia and geoengineering, and how do we think about all this? What do we do?
I'll put my cards on the table, if you like. I think that the geoengineering, that the kinds we've just heard about, are the kind of end result of what some would call the Enlightenment program, or this whole tradition of Western thought, which saw the universe as a machine. This would actually literally turn the planet into a machine. It could also be argued to be a form of my Gaia 2.0, a sort of self-aware self-regulation, but a one I would vote, if I'm allowed to democratically, strongly against. I think what we want is what I'm going to call, for the sake of argument, Gaia engineering, just even though they have the same word root, and that is rather we take some lessons from Gaia out as to how to run our own society and our own interaction with the rest of Gaia in a much more long-term sustainable way that I've also already described some of the elements of. For me, that's the smart thing to do, and the risks and the kind of global technocracy that would be required to run some of these global geoengineering schemes fill me with absolute horror as a human being.
How about you?
Well, I agree with Tim. I mean, the way Gaia would do it is to ensure that the waste product from one activity is the feedstock for another, and that's what's not happening at present. Our waste is not the feedstock for another element of the system, so that's what we need to achieve. And I think there's a general principle that if you have a problem, it's much better to sort it out at source rather than to try and patch it up literally at the tailpipe, because you will always end up with unintended consequences and imperfect fit. So Jim's example of solar reflectivity engineering is one more permanent way, and of course if it caused trouble you could go up there and rip it up and throw it away and return to where you were, so you could recover. But of course there are cheaper offers on being considered where you seed the contrails of aircraft with sulfur particles and so on. The trouble with that is that if you go in that direction, you're committed to doing it forever, because if you stop, the aerosols drop out of the atmosphere quickly, and then you get the full brunt of whatever accumulated potential for global warming that you've allowed to aggregate up in the meantime. The other thing, of course, is that the other sort of falling under the same general title of geoengineering is the withdrawal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We need to do a lot of that just to get back the stuff that we shouldn't have put there in the first place. But there's a misconception that if you drew carbon dioxide back down to the point where we got to 280 parts per million, what you might call the natural interglacial level, there's every expectation. In fact, Jim's own models show that the system is so complex it's likely to suffer hysteresis and sit up in the warm state that you've shifted it into and stay locked there and not just drop back down again. So again, much better to solve the problem at source rather than try and fix it downstream.
Right, we could talk about that for a long time. We're not going to. We've got 10 minutes left. Let's take some more questions from the audience. Up there at the top,
yes,
in the corner.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, with the Gaia 2.0 hypothesis, if you saw any benefit in us developing our self-awareness as individuals, groups, kindly awareness, self-awareness, and how that might help where we find ourselves.
Absolutely. Collective self-awareness, collective action, indeed. Yeah. Perhaps enough said. And I don't pretend to have much expertise on this thing called consciousness, but my friend Bruno, who I flashed up on the slides, has been busy teaching me that the latest thinking on consciousness is it's really just an elaborate error correction mechanism that's going on inside us. So we mustn't perhaps get too aggrandized ideas about what the phenomenology is here. And I think all the power and all the potential for change, and for the better as well, it lies in networks, in innovation, and in collective sensitivity and kind of I was tempted to say collective intelligence as well.
It's a very good question. In any feedback system, in your central heating regulation system, you have to have something that is sensing the parameter you want to control. So you have a temperature sensor, a thermostat, and if you're above the temperature, it'll turn your system off. If you're below the temperature, it'll turn it on. And as Tim says, our senses are in many ways just part of a complex feedback system that allows us to interact with the real world. So there's been a lot of thinking about, well, what vital signs of the planet could we offer humanity, politicians, business people, us, that would allow us to regulate, to sort of feed back. And of course, science has shown that sea level is rising, temperatures are changing and so on, but a huge amount of work has been done by organizations like the Global Climate Observing System and the World Met Organization, and you can go to websites and you can find series of parameters, showing how they've been changing over decades, the satellite era, 30 years or more. And the idea is that making people aware of these could change behavior. But anybody who's tried to lose weight knows that, the simple act of measuring your weight each morning doesn't necessarily lead to the result that you're looking for. You've got to connect it to action as well. But it's an essential first step. If you don't have those measures, then you can't control on anything because you don't know what you're trying to control on. And a lot of effort is going into generating vital signs that hopefully will get connected with political behavior and business behavior and so on. So it's a step in the right direction, but unfortunately it's not happening at on the scale and urgency that we really need.
Let's try and squeeze in another question from somewhere over here. Somewhere on the back, on the back section there, because we haven't had anyone from up there. Yep.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering, how important do you think humanity is today in the Gaia system, considering the problems that we run into? If we were, say, pushed out of the system, how long is Gaia likely to continue, say, considering that the energy source for the Earth, the sun, has a finite existence? Is humanity quite important in continuing this further than the life of the sun? I mean, I know that Jim has his views on it, but I don't know, I'd be interested to hear your point of view as well.
Well, for anyone worried about this, the sun has a while to go. So we've got a thinking time about this. But Tim, what do you think about that?
When I see Jim these days, he's often talking about how humans could be a crucial part of the long-term persistence of Gaia. We could deflect that really damaging asteroid that's coming towards us with whatever nuclear warheads into space or whatever it would need. And maybe we'll even be able to terraform to send propagules of Gaia further out into the solar system to buy us some time. But all of that's predicated on what would be an extraordinarily long lifespan for any species, let alone our own, given that most species last an average of something like 7 million years, is it? Or a few million years. So right now, if we came out of the equation, I can tell you how long roughly it would take for our carbon perturbation to be drawn away by Gaia's natural processes. It would be about 500,000 years, and then things will settle down, and we would predict from our models that Gaia will keep running against a brightening sun for 1 to 1.5 billion years still. So I don't think we're sailing we need to sail to the rescue, or indeed we're going to any time soon. I think we need to get our own house in order if we want, and consider it, well, perhaps in a more selfish species perspective, which is, can we actually, can we flourish? Can we persist and flourish? Because we're not going to if we carry on doing what we're doing.
It's worth reminding everybody that in the long history of the planet and the even longer history of the universe, the last 50 years is an absolute blink. It's a tiny little sliver. But, if you could choose the time to live in all of human history, this is a really interesting time to live. It's a slightly frightening time to live. But not only have we been so prosperous, but humanity, through its massive explosion of population, I mean, when I was born, the human population was 2.5 billion, something like that. It's 3 times that now. And also the equally or much greater explosion of economic activity, which means also the movement of materials and energy and general disruption of cycles. We fix more nitrogen than the natural cycle does. And that great acceleration, so-called great acceleration, all kicked off in about 1960, 1970. So we're talking about the last 30, 40 years. What's fascinating is that in that time, humans have gone from being a disruptor of the planet at the landscape scale. So, there used to be trees on Dartmoor, but, our predecessors chopped them all down. So we've had landscape scale impacts. Often you would judge them to be not particularly good. But what's happened in the last 50 years is that humanity has started to affect the planet at the level of its metabolism. We have changed the energy balance of the planet. As we sit here, the energy is accumulating mainly in the ocean, 94% in the ocean. It's as if every single person on the planet had 20 1.5 kilowatt kettles and was just pouring hot water continuously into the ocean. So we've gone from damage on the landscape scale to damage on the global scale, at the metabolism scale. That's what we call the Anthropocene. And so now we are exerting Gaia 2 unwittingly, one way or another. Tim's point is that that science has revealed what's going on. So we now have the opportunity, if we can get our wits together, to grab the controls and do it in a witting way, which is more harmonious with the system. And what Tim is saying is, let's look at how the system handled this through a series of evolutionary processes, many of them by chance, building one on another, and see if we can grab the handles in that way and find a harmonious balance with the planet, which is our life support system. Where does the oxygen come from?
Okay, so we've had some questions from online. We haven't got time to go into them, but just to give you an idea of what they're thinking about, there was a question about how do we rethink business models to respect or recognise that economics and the environment are not separate things. There's a question about Gaia making quantitative predictions, and a question about ocean seeding, whether that's geoengineering or Gaia engineering. I like this word Gaia engineering. I hadn't heard that before. So just before we get to the final, we've got a final word from Jim, but before we get there, I want to just ask you both, and you've sort of answered this already, but this, very briefly, if you would, what do we do with this information? We are an intelligent species. We've measured lots of things. We have Gaia. Should we choose to use it? What do we do in the short, potted version? Oh, look at that. I told them to be them to be quick. And
okay,
then
I'll be quick. Daniel Kahneman, who some of you may have come across his book, Thinking Fast and Straight, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who has put a huge amount of effort into understanding human psychology, human behavior. And there's a clip of him on the internet, and he understands how people work as individuals and collectively. And he says, with a very gloomy look, he said, I'm very pessimistic about humanity's ability to deal with climate change and indeed the sustainability of the planet. He said, everything I see about human behavior tells me that, there are people who get it. Probably a lot of people in this audience would want to identify with that. But, just look at what's going on in Westminster at present. It doesn't leave you with very much hope, does it? And so humanity, by and large, for whatever reason, is really struggling to get to grips with these huge, complex problems. And in fact, the reaction to them is to try and oversimplify, popularize, demonize, tribalize, and that's exactly the wrong direction to go in. So is there a glimmer of hope? Well, there is a kind of weird, almost science fiction-y, technocratic one, which is that we may develop humans too. There's a lot of work going on at present to develop human exoskeletons, to develop increased sensory perception in humans, and indeed to modify humans by inserting things, by enhancing them biologically, by changing them genetically. So one possible route to the future, which you may find a bit fantastic, would be that we simply generate humans too, at which point we all become redundant. Humans too, if they've got any sense, probably get rid of us all, because then they can get on with managing the planet in a properly Gaian way, and maybe maybe I should be quiet.
yeah, everyone thought it was the robots that were going to take over, but no, it turns out it's just our...
But let me just tell you one thing. There is a guy in the States who has a series of sensors, little actuators on his back, an array, I think it's 100 by 100, into which they're feeding economic data from the financial exchanges, and his brain is feeling that stuff, and the brain is very plastic.
What did he do to deserve this?
What did he do? They are waiting for him to say, buy, sell, not understanding why, and make an enormous amount of money. So, you know, it's all creeping up on us. It's happening.
Okay, right. Have you got anything happier to say?
I've got a short answer because I've had plenty of time to think about it. And I proceed it by saying I'm really an atheist, or certainly agnostic. But I think the first step is probably to realise the miracle of our existence in this extraordinary system, the debt we owe to other life forms, the desecration we're causing to our own life support system, but to cherish that miracle that's got us here 3.8 billion years later in the first place. And there's still microbes running the world around us. And I think only if we can connect to that are we going to find some kind of salvation and part in that system.
So basically, it's either humans too or the microbes that are going to be running the world. Just to finish off very quickly, we've got one more clip from Jim on the future of humanity, I think.
Well, if you want my personal view on this, and it is part of a book that I've just written, I don't think that humanity is going to be bothering about this very much longer. Perhaps not longer than this century. We are evolving still and changing, and the things we're changing into are brighter than we are. And I'm not talking about robots now or mechanical devices. I'm talking about evolution. Where we all of us are evolving into other things, and it's. I think it's a very interesting future.
You're quite optimistic.
As optimistic as anybody touching 100 can be.
And on that topic, Tim gets a bit of a plug at the end here. Go on, you want to tell us what this is?
Well, just to say that to celebrate Jim's birthday, which is actually the 26th of July, we'll be hosting a centenary meeting in Exeter. I'd love some of you to join us, and Chris and Helen will be there and part of it. And there's the link at the bottom.
Can I add one last anecdote? I was invited to Jim's 90th birthday, and I thought to myself, what can you give somebody who's 90-year-old Jim? So I persuaded some of my colleagues from BAS to let me have a piece of ancient ice, drilled out of the Antarctic ice sheet. And so they got me a dewar of this thing, the night before, and I got it to Blenheim, and duly took this piece of ice out and gave it to Jim, I think a couple of thousand years old. And at the end of the evening, he said to me, I too wish you hadn't done that, Chris. I thought, oh my God, what have I done? He said, I spent the whole dinner worrying about what we should be measuring from it.
So that's the kind of mind we need to give us a way out of this. Okay, so we're here, thank you, Jim, if you're listening online, for all of these ideas and all of this inspiration. I hope that everyone who's been here will be encouraged to just, think about this a little bit different, find out about these things, think about the history of ideas and the future of ideas. Don't think about turning into humans 2.0. That's a few years down the line. But thank you very much for coming, and please join me in thanking our two panellists, Chris and Tim.
Thanks.